Good afternoon. It's actually even worse than my family having been in the wrong place at the wrong time for hundreds of years. I personally have a reputation of being a typhoid Mary in my family, and that you never want to live, so don't move to New York right after I leave, because I spent a year away from college. I was at Stanford, and there was an earthquake while I was gone. I moved to LA, and when I left, there was an earthquake. I moved to Sydney from LA, and then there were fires when I left. I moved to Zimbabwe and destroyed the entire economy. But the worst is the incident where I first moved to New York when my husband and I were living there. We lived in a big tower building on the uptown, we didn't live in the Twin Towers. It's not quite that bad, but it was, I don't know if you all remember when a baseball player was flying his own personal plane and died crashing into an apartment building. Yeah, right after I moved. So just, it's fine to be there while I'm there, but my parents won't even go on vacation anywhere I've moved away from at this point. So I think that gives me a unique vantage point for looking at the world and how broad trends might play out. I run a group at Bain called the Macro Trends Group. I think we need to turn this one off. Sorry about that. Which looks at economic, social, political, demographic trends as they cut across industries and geographies and impact the business environment. And while this may sound a little bit like the Karen Harris Self-Full Employment Act, macro trends have become uniquely important in the business environment today in a way that when many of us started working, you could comfortably ignore what was happening in the environment at large. My first job out of college was in M&A, and we could do valuation models where we'd put in 3% growth in perpetuity as a placeholder and not look like a complete idiot, which is unimaginable today when you think about just how much that has changed. Today I'm going to focus on a particular set of themes we call Labor 2030, which is the cross-hatching, the intersection of a number of important themes that are going to create a very volatile decade or two, and I think are important for anyone thinking about business strategy to understand. But to understand why those are so important, we need to start back at what we've just come through, which was an extraordinary, abnormal period that we call the Great Moderation, when the world was largely peaceful. This is the Soviet Union had fallen, the West had won the battle, the economic battle, the geopolitical battle, the philosophical battle. It was a time of extraordinary global growth and relatively uninteresting macro environment, really the perfect time to be growing a business. And macro just didn't matter then. Right? The reason that we weren't focused even at Bain on these broad topics is you could assume away the environment and really think about industry dynamics, technology dynamics, your own management style, and be fine. And what changed was, of course, the buildup of those forces which went unnoticed really came and kind of punched us all in the face during the global financial crisis. And it was around then it became clear that something was shifting in the macro environment, something not ignorable. But even since then, despite our own insecurities and uncertainties, the growth environment has been relatively benevolent. Everyone waiting for the next problem, but relatively steady. But it's interesting to see what comes next. And we hear a lot, Larry Summers at Harvard is renowned for talking about secular stagnation, right? This perception that things are only going to sort of peter out from here. There's Tyler Cowen, who essentially, right, I'm hyperbolizing a little, but now that we've invented the flush toilet, we've kind of got nothing left to look forward to. I mean, I'm grateful for them, but it does feel like there might be a few innovations left in our future. And so at the Macro Trends Group, we look at the long arc of history. Sometimes going back 800 years to really understand how patterns could be playing out, what we should be looking at to understand the context. And so in our view, we're at this flat point in the curve, but we're on the threshold of another wave of growth. And we're calling this period, this inflection point, the Great Transformation, for a number of reasons. The most important one probably being, holy cow, that's a lot. I thought marketing department, that was a little unwieldy. And because so many of the critical underlying secular forces that we assumed are changing, in some cases really dramatically. And it's hard to emphasize how important this is without sounding, again, like I'm hyperbolizing. So I want to take you through just a few of them and then dive more deeply into a couple. So where are we today? The three that I'm going to focus on at the top, the end of supernormal labor growth. Every problem we had in business in terms of production productivity could be solved because there was another warm body to be thrown at it. Labor pools were expanding at an abnormal clip over decades, and that was the environment we were operating in, competition based on wages going down. And productivity stagnated. Why? Because what is productivity? Productivity is taking a human being and combining it with capital and creating a productivity improvement. But when you can take a human being and rather than invest in capital, get a cheaper human being, then you end up with lower productivity but higher and lower wages, but you're still able to produce the same things. And that's changing. And I'll dive into that more and show you that detail. Automation in the service sector. So we've had automation in industrial production for decades, although even that is accelerating. But the service sector has been largely immune. And it's all been done by hand. And we're going to see over the next decade a geometric uptick in automation in the service sector, which will, again, change the nature of how labor forces and economies work. Demand-constrained growth. That is economist wonk for we make more stuff than warm hearts to buy it. When you're in a demand-constrained growth environment, you are facing deflation. Right? You're competing based on cost. You see the cost of goods going down. Most of the world is in an environment like that today, with the exception of the major economies, India and Brazil, largely because the infrastructure is so bad that even if you have a pile of stuff, you can't get it to the people who want it, and so you're fighting off inflation. But where you have demand-constrained growth, there are a number of factors, a number of symptoms of that, one of which is economic inequality. Right, which I'll talk about again in more detail. We're starting from that place now, and that's a situation that's actually going to get exacerbated over the next 10 years. Two other forces that I'm not going to talk about is the declining cost of distance. Bain, we started looking at this actually because I saw I read the New York Times, which is always a mistaken way to start my day, but I don't know what I was thinking, I did. And they had an article with an infographic that I looked up online that showed how many of us would be living in megacities by 2050, in advanced economies, megacities. So they showed this graphic with the buildings like 500 stories tall. Just a show of hands, how many of you think it sounds like fun to live in a megacity in a 400-foot tall building? Anyone? Just raise hands. Okay, one. Right. So I asked this question all right. So a small minority, I think we can safely say. So I spent a year asking, every time I did a presentation, I'd ask this question and got a similar response. I thought, all right, explain to me why the people I'm talking to are executives. They're affluent, they can choose how they're going to live. So why is it that we're all going to do something no one wants to do over the next 3 decades, right? This just defied common sense. And then as you look into what defines, why do people move to urban environments? Well, first, because you need big pools of labor. Right? You aggregate labor. The city is an invention of the Industrial Revolution to move the stuff you need and the people who process it into more stuff you need closer together because it's efficient. But if a machine does all of that, we don't need a big pool of labor. So in advanced economies, why are we clustering? Furthermore, if the cost of distance is dropping dramatically. So the receptionist in the New York office sent out a message a couple years ago that said, hey, great news, you can now buy stamps with PayPal. And one of our more witty partners sent around a hand-drawn graph, a Venn diagram, 2 circles. People who use stamps, people who use PayPal, right? The cost of moving information is just about 0, right? There's no one using fax machines anymore. And so the idea, the cost of moving goods, right? Remember, you probably don't, most of you, but I remember when you'd go to a bookstore, it's a thing that you buy books in. Ask your dad about it. And if they were out of a book, you'd put it on order, and 2 weeks later, you'd go back in and pick it up. Now, if you have to wait, it's like, what is it? It's not Amazon Prime? I have to wait 24 extra hours. This is outrageous. I'll just download it. I can't wait. And so the idea that we need to cluster when the cost of moving goods is collapsing, the cost of moving information is 0, and we don't need big pools of labor, the declining cost of distance. And sure enough, everyone was shocked at the census results that showed the growth of cities are slowing and people are moving out into exurbs more and more. Combine that with the superabundance of capital we've had driving up asset prices, and ask any young family about the cost of living in, I don't know, San Francisco, and then you're surprised that they're moving to places outside. So that is another force that we've seen, a big change that we've seen happening. And then I think one of the more important ones, which we see a lot of signs of today, is the erosion of America's hegemony, America's willingness or ability to dominate the global political environment and create it to what its will had been 30 years ago. In some respects, I think the view of the US is shifting in terms of what that environment should be, but the US is clearly pulling back in trying to dominate and run many multilateral institutions, and that's a big shift. And the result of all of these changes is financial and macro volatility that we'll see that's nothing like anyone in this room has seen. It really will resemble things we haven't seen for a few decades. A boom-bust cycle, which I'll outline, what we call post-urbanization in advanced economies, people changing where they live and work, an increasingly muscular role of the state in markets around the world. We're already seeing signs of that, but I'll talk about why. And then a renewed post-World War II geopolitical order. That's a pretty great transformation. But as I said, I want to zero in on 3 of those, demographics, automation, and inequality. Because we actually started looking at shifting demographics and changing labor pools, and what we saw was that you really can't understand the impact of those changes without simultaneously looking at the role of automation, of course, as a substitute for that workforce, and the point of inequality to understand how those changes might happen. And when we looked at all 3 of those together, it's a very complex macro environment. So as business strategists, present and future, really something to think about, helping navigate that external environment, the turbulence in it, and in particular this reset of the market-government relationship, which I know everyone in this room is really looking forward to seeing more of. So why do we say that? Well, let's start with the change in the workforce with demographics. Since World War II, a quarter of growth in the OECD and a third of growth in the US came from just increases in labor. What does that mean? It's not innovations, iPads, cool ideas, just another beating heart thrown into the labor pool, right, is a driver of growth. Why was that happening? Well, for 3 very important reasons. First, we had the baby boomers coming into the workforce really accelerating in the 1970s, right, that generation born in the 40s and 50s. Also starting in the 1970s, we had women coming into the workforce in a major way. In 1970, labor force participation amongst women in advanced economies globally was 30%. Today, it's above 70%. there's not much more you can do, right? I suppose you could fire them all and hire them back, but that doesn't actually increase labor participation. That's kind of like the logic where hurricanes are good for GDP that you sometimes hear. It's destruction. There'll be a big lift in GDP. It's like, but wrecking stuff and then fixing it isn't, oh, never mind. It's great. And then finally, the major contribution to the world's workforce has been the integration of India, but in particular China, to the global environment. So China began to integrate into the global economy in the 90s, joined the WTO in the early part of the 2000s, but it's not obviously Chinese workers traveling all over the world. It's Chinese products that contain that portion of the labor costs from incredibly productive and abundant Chinese labor. With those investments in infrastructure that really created that miraculous lift out of poverty for hundreds of millions of people. But that labor growth that you can see from 1970 to 1990, just to put that in perspective, during that time period, US labor force growth grew at 2.6% per annum. In 2000, labor force growth in the US was 1.2% per annum, so less than half of that. For the next decade, 0.4%. Right, so that is a really dramatic slowing. In the EU, labor force growth will be negative 0.5% on average, and it's worst in the stronger economies of the northern region, particularly Germany. So when we look forward over the next decades, you can see that there really isn't a region that can add the kind of labor force that we're looking for. The only economy that has a growing labor force at scale is India, right? And I say that we hear a lot about growth, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, yes, 54 countries on the continent of Africa, many of them are growing, but there's no scalability there, right? The fact that Nigeria and Angola are both growing is really not that helpful, given that they're miles and miles apart and not even connected by roads and barely by airports. So we're seeing the diminishment, the pullback of this labor force growth. And the next logical question is, well, aren't we living longer, right? We're living longer, healthier lives. Aren't we working longer? Is that going to help offset some of this 15 to 64 population? What if we said 15 to 80? Would that change what we're looking at? Well, lifespan growth is decelerating at the moment. So from 1950 to 1980, lifespans expanded by 6 years. From 1980 to 2010, another 5 years. Looking forward, we're looking at another 2 years. What could really shift that, and where there's really interesting developments happening, is in what's called geroprotection. So it's not curing cancer and curing heart disease, the diseases that come as a result of aging. If we did that today, just said no one will ever die of those again, we still only get an additional 2 years of life expectancy. It's really looking at aging as a disease at a cellular level, and thinking of heart disease, cancer as symptoms of aging rather than the causes of death, where there is a lot of really interesting work in lab. But in order for this to change the outcome we were looking at in terms of the labor force, we'd have to have broad-scale adoption of major life expectancy changes over the next 5 years, which is it's just hard to believe it would disseminate that quickly, particularly given the lumpiness of our healthcare system. Today, in the US, there is one outstanding reason that people work longer, just one: because they can. It's not because they need to. Lots of people are financially in a position where they would like or should be working longer. They don't have retirement savings. But if you're a 55-year-old drywaller, your opportunities for working into your 70s are very diminished. Whereas if you're a strategy consultant, I plan to be, dragged demented out of my office in my 90s. Kicking and screaming. Actually, speaking of dementia, which is not funny at all, but I'm going to leave you with this very creepy thought. One of the doctors that we work with a lot has an hypothesis that the reason all these zombie apocalypse TV shows and movies are so popular now is that we all have this subliminal fear of healthy, demented old people, right? Or that we'll be them. It's like, that's so possibly true and disturbing that I thought I'd share it with all of you right after you ate lunch. So moving on from lifespan growth decelerating, what does this mean? So I painted a scenario where growth has come from an expanding workforce. That workforce is no longer expanding. The growth is flattening or even shrinking in many critical economies, China, Germany. And we're not living longer enough in broad enough numbers to really offset that. So all other things being equal, in that environment, what happens? Well, we are living longer, right? We did expand life expectancy by 11 to 12, 13 years since 1980s. And what we've seen is that actually today's 65-year-old consumes like a 55-year-old did, but they're retiring. So we have a situation where our productivity, our workforce, our ability to produce is declining, but demand is declining less slowly, which is a recipe for stagflation. But the good and bad news is there's an app for that, right? What is happening is changes in automation in the service sector are fundamentally transforming the productivity and output and cost bases in sectors like food service and hospitality, retail, trade, that hadn't been affected before. And when we did this work at Bain, what we saw two things. One is the increase in operating savings would be 10 to 15%, productivity improvements 30%. This is today's commercialized or commercializable technology. This isn't self-driving vehicles, right? Getting rid of truck drivers. This is cobots, sensors, human hand dexterity, the fact that that you check yourself out with an iPad at stores, the kinds of things that are already being used. Warehousing is a great example of that. So declining workforce means, and we've seen this, wages going up, right? We run out of warm bodies to put into the workforce in the US at the end of this year, at the rate we've been going. We saw the unemployment numbers come out today, 3.7%, right? We haven't seen that since the 60s. As that pushes wages up, what's gonna happen? Amazon bought Kiva in 2013, right? We have the technology to automate warehouses. It's just not being done because it's cheaper to keep human beings in that. But that tension, that trade-off won't be that way for long. And once we start innovating in sectors, we will see that we can increase productivity and expansion by dramatic amounts. And this is looking from now to 2030. So what you can't see in the bottom left corner is this is a comparison between 2015 and 2030. So just to look at that in relative history, to see that in a comparison, we looked at some of the other big transformations we've been through, because the pushback I get when I do this in California is something along the lines, people in Silicon Valley today, again, painting them with a broad brush, are very modest and their aspirations very small and they're not the slightest bit self-important. So when you go present something like this there and they say, oh, you're such a Luddite, you don't understand, we've been through this before and we're better off. And I can stipulate that in 2040 or 2050, we can all be better off. But when you look at these transitions, let's start with agriculture to industry, 1900 to 1940, very broad in the US, very broad and relatively slow. That's 4 decades of transition. If we level set that workforce to today's workforce size, we would have lost 1.2 million jobs a year, 1.2 million a year. Again, over 40 years. And I might point out that from 1900 to 1940, we had a couple little hiccups that we might not want to repeat. World War I, Great Depression, build up to World War II. And of course, by 1950, anyone would rather have been living, or most people would rather have been living in 1950 than 1930. But not a smooth transition. Compare that again, 1970 to 1990, the transition from manufacturing to services in the US. again, not a smooth decade. We lost about 800 million jobs over about 20 years then. And then the latest boom bust was construction, 600 million a year in that construction boom bust leading up to the financial crisis, so less than half a decade. If we look at that 30% productivity improvement and think about what that means for the workforce, we're looking at 2.5 million jobs lost per year over 20 years, twice as broad and twice as fast. Let me just go back to that for 1 second. And you see, what we've seen over the last 100 years is the US economy's ability to absorb jobs, so to replace the ones that are displaced, is about 700,000 a year. So let's say I am wrong and all the guys out in California are right and we're twice as innovative as we have ever been before. We're still looking at a displacement the size of the agriculture to industry, which again contained that Depression era boom bust. And so regardless of how you cut this data, it's hard to see a path forward that doesn't involve a substantial amount of displacement and volatility. And the challenge of that is that we're starting from a very, very unequal point in our economy. So the impact of automation is highly unequal. Certainly in the early years, the beneficiaries are either the people who own the equipment or the innovators, right? The people who think of the ideas. And that's about 20% of the workforce. They get the early gains. Whereas 80% of the workforce has to be cheaper than a robot in order to have a job, crudely speaking. And about 20 to 25% of people at that 30% productivity improvement, that 2.5 million, end up disemployed due to automation, and that disproportionately hits lower wage workers, starting where we are at a level of inequality that we haven't seen since prior to World War II. So the bottom half prior to World War II, this is income. Bottom half of the US earned about 14% of total income, the top 10%, 45%. Today we're at numbers moderately worse than that. Right? And looking at a decade of that sort of displacement. So what is this overall picture? We have this decelerating labor force growth. Right now, that's where we are today. That's a labor shortage phase where we see wages go up, right? Where the economy appears to be in a really nice boom phase. During that period, all the way through from now going forward, we see this steady rise of inequality. We might see a slight offset now while we have wages rising, but generally speaking, we see this drumbeat up of jobs eroding as we see this massive investment phase in this boom in automation, because that 30% productivity improvement means two things. First, we have to buy the equipment, right? Buying the stuff, that's about half of this $4 trillion. But you also change the infrastructure. If you have a restaurant that today has a chef and 2 sous chefs, right, and you replace the 2 sous chefs with a robot, you don't need the counter space. You don't even need that robot to be in the sunlight. You put them in the dark. You just need to be able to pull them out and fix them. And so you either shrink your footprint, and we're massively over-retailed in terms of footprint in the US today, right now, or you use that to create drone delivery landing spots or more table space or communal tables. There are lots of ways to use that space, but all of them involve a build-out. That investment will mask. We'll see growth that could be upward of 3%, more volume, again, up and down, will mask the steady erosion of demand, because losing 20% of employment and having 80% wage suppressed means that that demand constraint, remember that wonky thing, not enough beating hearts to buy stuff, gets worse and worse, until inevitably when that investment boom ebbs, we see a crash. You can put it in 2029 if you like to be funny historically, but it's really looking out over the next 10 to 15 years, 15 to 20, we see this boom bust phase. So what does that mean, right? What are the implications of that? Well, first, beyond the report, we will see a labor force with new skills. I have no doubt, I really do not doubt the innovative ability of the US in particular to create new jobs and new opportunities. The caveat is simply the speed at which it would be required doesn't lend itself to a smooth transition. Right? We'll see that we'll have new productivity gains, new industries that I can't even conceive of today. I mean, incredibly exciting. Again, it's a really exciting time to be innovating and thinking, and we'll see a recovering global economy on the back of that. But in the meantime, we have set up, and here's my challenge to those of you who are still in school, we've set up our business education to be focused on the great moderation period, again, where the external environment didn't matter, was very stable. And we tend to look at things like capital allocation, right? When was the last time a great business idea said, well, I could get started, but the one thing I don't have is enough investors. You know, gosh, we're really short of capital chasing after growing economies. We look at return on assets, return on equity. Rather than rewarding growth or patience, we look at taking out costs. That creates very brittle businesses. In a volatile environment, it's really resiliency that matters. We're all going to make mistakes. I've made probably 5 in the last 10 minutes. You can figure out which ones those are later. But right, we all make mistakes, and we'll all have errors of judgment. You want your business to be resilient to those, thinking about options and hedges that help you survive that environment. From the perspective of consulting and consultants, what does this mean, right? The consulting business was founded based on the kinds of tools that are now readily accessible on an iPad, right? The kind of data analytics, the sorts of things we used to do by hand, you can now do while you're walking along the street, although I wouldn't recommend it unless you want to hit a light post. But that being said, what all that means is that the frontier of what's knowable has been pushed out. Business strategy, business judgment is about a projection and prediction. It's not about the knowable, it's about the judgment as to how to handle the uncertain. The frontier of the uncertain has moved out more, but those sorts of normative questions, what do my customers really want? What is really their pain point? That's not automatable in the near term, and that's where the kinds of tools that you learn, the thinking kinds of things get pushed out. That's where consulting, that's the future of the business and where it's going. It's not going away. We could answer what the future looked like, then the Fed would just run an algorithm and sit at home, right? Turns out they meet a whole lot and talk a whole lot, lots of minutes. And so it is really just thinking about what are the automatable, when I think about my own career, what is it that machine that's repeatable and objective that a machine could do better than I can, and what are really the questions at the frontier that we need to answer? And as the macro person at Bain, I would say, looking around the world and thinking about not just a single, you can get a million reports that will show you demographics, that will show you automation, that will show you inequality, but thinking about how those come together and play out is really the key insight that you'll need to think about your business. So I'd encourage all of you to think about what are the lateral skills that I'd need to develop going forward, and how can I best invest in that to be robust? I need 0. All of those charts can be found on our website at bain.com in the Labor 2030. I mean, you're welcome to take all the pictures you want, but they won't run away and get clicked away if you want to download that. And I'll be answering questions after my friend and colleague speaks next. Okay.
Okay, thank you. This is going to be fun. We're going to have a little bit of an interactive dialogue here, so I'll probably do some walking around, and I'll also lower my mic since volume has never been my struggle. I'm a strategy consultant. I love to go and help solve complex problems. early on in my career, I realized that just having the right idea wasn't too interesting. The brilliance was in the implementation. And it was much better to have an efficacious idea that had high impact than to have the right idea. One of the ways to go about doing that was building internal capacity. What I'm going to talk about today is a mechanism to inculcate capacity within an organization. We do this all the time, and it's a blast. And it's helping individuals harness the very best out of their teams. So we tell leaders, you don't have to have all the ideas. You don't have to be the smartest one in the room. There's a process in which you can get the very best thinking from within your group. Rigorous research has been done on how the best ideas percolate to the top and how the worst ideas percolate to the bottom. Percolate, that's probably, drop to the bottom. And so we know the right processes that work. Now this slide, you notice Karen didn't have this because she's a Bain. Everybody knows Bain is amazing. This is my effort to say, hey, Cicero's cool too. A couple weeks ago, we were rated in the Vault's top 50 consulting firms. I think we landed 40th, and I think we landed 4th as best places to work among consulting firms, which was really cool for us. Yes, I know, Karen, Bain was probably number 1, but we thought we were cool just being considered in the top 50. So that's a little plug on the firm before we start. So let's talk about effective group decision making. Raise of hands. What type of structure is most able to generate the very best decisions? Who thinks it's an individual? Who thinks it's a group? Okay, most of you think it's a group, all right. Well, let me ask this question then. What type of structure is most able to generate the very worst decisions? Who thinks it's an individual? Who thinks it's a group? Well, again, research would indicate that along this continuum, both the ceiling and the floor expand as you incorporate more people. And this is where the pejorative groupthink originates. When you get a group of people together and come up with a really, really, really dumb idea. The Nazis in the 40s probably modeled this the best. But if you look at history, there's multiple examples of groups coming together in order to just collectively decide on really stupid things. But there's a real reward if you learn how to harness your group in getting really good thinking. And again, rigorous research would suggest that simply by managing a process, it's pretty predictable what the outcome is going to be. So let's talk about this just briefly. When you want to realize the advantages of a group, when